By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was no longer expanding. It was collapsing. German forces were falling back from France and Belgium, retreating toward the shrinking borders of the Reich. And with that retreat came something the Nazi system had never truly prepared for on a massive scale: surrender. Entire formations laid down their weapons. Supply units were cut off. Clerks, signal operators, nurses, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and teenage girls pulled into service through the Reich's auxiliary organizations suddenly found themselves in enemy hands. For years, they had been warned about what capture by the Americans would mean. They expected rage. They expected humiliation. Some expected worse. What many of them encountered instead began not with violence, but with something far more disorienting: silence. For numerous German women taken prisoner by American forces in late 1944 and early 1945, the most shocking part of capture was not the moment of surrender. It was what followed. There were shouted commands in English, brisk and firm, but no immediate blows, no chaotic revenge. Just confusion, then movement. They were marched away from the front in long, weary columns. Temporary holding areas came first. These were not permanent prison camps with guard towers and concrete walls. They were improvised spaces, abandoned farms, schoolyards, shattered factories, open fields wrapped in barbed wire. In France and Belgium, U.S. Army processing teams worked under relentless pressure as tens of thousands of prisoners arrived daily. Supplies were stretched thin. Winter had set in early, turning the ground hard and damp. Shelter was often inadequate. Hunger lingered constantly at the edges of every day. The women were separated from male prisoners quickly, sometimes within hours. This was less about ideology and more about regulation and order. U.S. Army directives required segregation where possible, and officers understood the discipline problems that mixed compounds could create. Female prisoners were grouped together in whatever structures could be secured. Commandeered buildings, canvas tents, long wooden barracks assembled in haste by engineer units. It was inside one such barracks that a small episode unfolded, one that many of the women would later remember more vividly than their actual capture. The interior was stripped down to the bare essentials: wooden floors, rough benches, no padding, no backs. The women had been moving for hours, some for days, in cold conditions and inadequate clothing. Many were exhausted and underfed. Some still wore thin skirts or poorly fitted coats never designed for winter exposure. When they were finally told to sit, relief came first. Then discomfort replaced it. The benches were nothing more than unfinished planks nailed onto simple frames. After days of strain, sitting did not soothe aching bodies. It concentrated the pain. Pressure cut sharply into hips and tailbones. Some shifted restlessly. Others stood again, choosing fatigue over the stabbing ache. A few began to laugh quietly, the brittle laughter that comes when exhaustion dulls embarrassment. Eventually, someone said it plainly in German: "Sitting hurts." The guards did not initially understand the words. Most were young American soldiers, military police, rear area troops, replacements, many scarcely older than the prisoners themselves. Their German vocabulary extended only to commands. Discomfort needs no translation. They saw the constant shifting, the grimaces, the way women tried to sit, and immediately rose again. One guard gestured, asking what was wrong. A German prisoner pointed to the bench, then to her lower back. "She mind pain." Another repeated the phrase slowly in broken English. "Sitting hurts." The guard pressed his palm against the rough wood, testing its hardness. He nodded, not grasping every word, but understanding enough. Without promising anything, he walked out. The women did not expect him to return with a solution. Years of propaganda had shaped their assumptions. They had been taught that American soldiers were undisciplined and cruel, that capture meant degradation. In the system they had known, complaints were weakness, and weakness invited punishment. Orders were absolute. Discomfort was irrelevant. So when the guard came back about an hour later, accompanied by two others carrying folded items, the barracks fell silent. They laid U.S. Army-issued blankets across the benches, olive drab, coarse but clean. In some areas, straw was added beneath the planks. In others, boards were adjusted or replaced. There were no speeches, No moral lessons delivered. The work was quiet and methodical. When they were finished, one guard made a simple gesture. "Sit." The women hesitated. Then one lowered herself carefully onto the newly covered bench. Her posture eased. The pain did not disappear, but it softened. Others followed. The difference was small, almost mundane, yet unmistakable. It was not an act of dramatic compassion. It was practical, restrained, almost bureaucratic. But in its ordinariness, it unsettled everything they had expected. Over the next weeks, similar moments accumulated. In several American-run compounds for female prisoners in France and later in southern Germany, guards arranged additional clothing when supplies allowed. Oversized field jackets were issued. Gloves appeared. A U.S. Army nurse at a processing facility near Reims recorded that women with severe foot pain were permitted to remove their boots during rest periods, an accommodation that would have been rare under German military discipline. Medical inspections followed established procedure. Lice were treated systematically. Frostbite cases were addressed promptly. Even matters rarely discussed in official reports, menstrual needs, for instance, were handled awkwardly but practically, often with Red Cross supplies or improvised measures. There was embarrassment, certainly, but no deliberate cruelty. The prisoners noticed something else. The Americans did not shout without reason. Orders were direct. Rules were enforced, yet consequences were consistent and predictable. There were no arbitrary punishments for the sake of fear, no collective reprisals for individual mistakes. For many of these women, it was their first prolonged experience of authority that did not depend primarily on intimidation. That did not mean captivity was comfortable. Rations were basic, canned food, thin soup, bread when available. Hunger was familiar. News from home was absent. Bombs could still be heard in the distance. The war had not ended. It had merely shifted location. And yet the small details stood out. A bench that no longer cut into bone, a blanket that smelled faintly of soap instead of smoke, a guard who reacted to thanks with a shrug as though he had done nothing extraordinary. By early 1945, as American forces moved deeper into Germany, the number of female prisoners increased. Some holding areas became more organized. Others remained temporary transit points. The system was strained and imperfect, but its underlying framework persisted. The Geneva Convention was not a distant concept to U.S. officers. It was embedded in training, paperwork, inspections, and accountability. Violations, when reported, were investigated, not flawlessly, but frequently enough to shape expectations. Unnecessary cruelty was discouraged rather than rewarded. For the women, the realization unfolded slowly. They were not being starved intentionally. They were not being humiliated to make a spectacle of defeat. They were not invisible. Years later, some struggled to reconcile these memories with the ideology they had served. A few spoke of guilt that they had been treated decently while atrocities had been carried out in the name of their state elsewhere. Others described confusion. A smaller number admitted to gratitude, though even that word felt complicated in post-war Germany. Yet across letters, interviews, and memoirs collected decades later, similar recollections appear. The repaired benches, the blankets laid down without comment, the quiet understanding that suffering was not required as proof of defeat. In the vast landscape of the Second World War, such details barely register. No campaign turned because a guard listened. No battle was decided by a layer of fabric over wood. History does not pause for benches. And yet for the women who sat and felt less pain than they had anticipated, something fundamental shifted. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster drawn from propaganda posters. Authority no longer meant automatic terror. Survival was not defined solely by endurance of cruelty, but by adaptation to a reality that contradicted what they had been taught to fear. After the war, many of these women returned quietly to civilian life. Some rebuilt families. Some carried private memories they rarely shared. Others never spoke of their captivity at all. But in scattered accounts preserved years later, a simple reflection repeats itself in different forms. We believed it would be worse. Sometimes history is shaped not by the horrors that occur, but by the punishments that never come. No retaliation followed the complaint. No revenge answered vulnerability. Only a blanket, a repaired bench, and the subtle revelation that even in war, pain did not have to be the point.